That's our sure sign that we're ready to begin. Thank you all. Good evening. My name is Leslie Pickle. I am the Managing Director of the Urban Guild, and I'm delighted to see all of you here this evening. I know we have many folks joining us from all over, so it's just a real pleasure to have you all here. This is a continuation of the Urban Guild's Live at the Guild webinar series on Design Matters. And this evening, we're pleased to welcome Gary Brewer, who is going to speak to us specifically about Large Infill Done Well, a Charleston, South Carolina case study. And Gary is not only, as many of you are aware, he is an Urban Guild board member, but he is a partner of Robert A.M. Stern Architects, where he leads the firm's design of institutional, hospitality, and residential projects. He is a fellow emeritus and a board member of the Institute for Classical Architecture and Art, and we are pleased to have him join us. Before I turn things over to Gary and the presentation, would just do a little bit of housekeeping for a moment to ask you all, as you're doing so well, please stay muted during the presentation. You're welcome to keep your videos off as well. And after the presentation ends, we'll begin the Q&A session. And we'll primarily be using the chat function to get that started and kick things off and see where it goes from there. So again, thank you and welcome on behalf of the Urban Guild. We're delighted to have you with us. And I'll now turn things over to Gary. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks to the Urban Guild for hosting this whole series. Jeff Mallon preceded me at the last, giving a wonderful presentation on celebration, and we're bound to have many more like these. Joe, can you share the screen, please? So Joe Yatko, who is an associate in our office, has been working with me on all these projects, and he has helped me put together this PowerPoint presentation. And what we're showing you, nothing of it is new. For the projects that we'll be showing you, we've had hundreds and hundreds of meetings and presentations. So we have it sort of in the can, so to speak. Next, please. So I'm assuming everyone here knows where Charleston is, bounded by the Cooper River and the Ashley River. It is an American gem of a city, and it should be on every architect's list of places to visit. I know that for the New Urbanist and our office in particular, it is sacred ground and has been used many times as precedents for streets and buildings and everything that makes it wonderful. Adjacent to it is also Kiowa Island, which is a resort community that is nearby. Next, please. So we started work in the region, not in Charleston, but in Kiowa in 1994. And Roger Seifter, who is a partner in our office, started with the first two projects. We did a house there, and we did the beach club there. And next, please. Although our team, my team, started to do work there nearly 15 years ago, we did the Ocean Course Clubhouse. And this is relevant because these projects in Kiowa, in a way, led us to a relationship of doing work in the Charleston area. Next, please. We just finished up 4 golfers' cottages, which is adjacent to the Ocean Course Clubhouse. The 2021 PGA tournament was just held there. If anyone would like to rent these cottages, they are available, I think, for between $8,000 and $10,000 a week. Next, please. On Kiowa, after doing the Ocean Course, we were asked to be part of a competition for the West Beach Village site. And we proposed a scheme with a hotel, a golf clubhouse, a conference center, and adjacent buildings. We ended up winning the competition, and our team started to do work on those projects. This was happening right at the sort of end of Courier Square in Charleston that I'll be showing you. Next, please. So the design proposal basically proposed a new hotel on the water with an access terminating with a golf clubhouse. Next, please. Joe, is there a lag? And the golf clubhouse was the first project that they built. So this was finished maybe about a year ago. Next, please. We also did a 600-room conference center, which is a gigantic footprint of a building. So our design proposed lining it with different buildings of different looks. Kiowa is full of shingle style architecture. And so for this project, we decided that we would bring a different look, something that was maybe more classical or colonial revival to kind of add to the mix of the building styles that are already there. Next, please. Like Seaside and other new urbanist communities, properties on Kiowa are available to rent. And we did a villa check-in rental building, which anyone who's renting a property there goes to this new little building to pick up their keys and get greeted, and then they drop them off there as well. Next, please. So having worked on this project, we worked with a landscape architect, a local landscape architect that I'll talk about later in the project, named Scott Parker. And Scott, in a way, led us to the work that we started to do in Charleston. Next, please. So the projects I'm going to quickly take you through are Courier Square, Phase 1, Lifestyles Communities, Courier Square Phase 2. We're doing a senior living project there, and we're also doing a hotel project. This is the peninsula of Charleston, bounded by the Cooper and the Ashley. Next. And this is the site of the northern properties. You can see Courier Square located right here. The elevated highway is located here. In the foreground is a residential neighborhood. But on the left-hand side, you can see the types of buildings that are typically being built in places like Charleston. Next, please. So Courier Square Phase 1 is on Meeting Street, and Evening Post Industries, that operates the local newspaper Post and Courier, has been buying property in the northern part of Charleston for the last 30 plus years. This area of Charleston, even 15 years ago, was on no man's land. But it has, as the city has sort of grown north and become such a hot spot for tourism, these properties are really worth quite a bit. So they currently own all of these lots right here. And Courier Square was the first project that we did with them. Next, please. So Charleston is a historic district, and it has a very elaborate review process to for any new construction or renovations. And for every project, including the ones that we have done, we go through this very long sequence of meetings with the various groups to show them any proposed design. Next. It's worth noting that right as we were getting Courier Square Phase 1 approved, the city of Charleston was going through sort of turmoil associated with the Board of Architectural Review, the BAR, and with the community groups being unhappy with the review process, but also with the built new projects. I mean, the sort of criticism was, if you have such an elaborate review process, why aren't the new buildings better? So Mayor Riley brought in DPZ in two separate work efforts. The first work effort was with Marina and Andreas, and they worked to help revamp the BAR process. They broke it into two separate meetings. There's now a Board of Architectural Review meeting for small projects, and then there's separate meetings for large projects. And then they also worked with the city of Charleston to come up with guidelines associated with how the BAR would judge whether a new project was approvable or not. The second phase was when Marina from DPZ went through about a year and a half of meetings with Jacob Lindsay and Josh Martin and the community to help rewrite the Height District. And so the new Height District is primarily where our projects are located. And the idea of the new Height District was to allow in a part of Charleston where there are a lot of empty lots that there could potentially be a higher density and taller buildings than what are typically seen in other parts of Charleston. Next, please. So who reviews an architect's design? Sort of in this order: Historic Charleston, the Preservation Society, the Assistant to the Mayor of Charleston, the City Planner, the City Architect, the community groups, and the Board of Architectural Review. And for every project that has to go in front of the BAR, there is a first meeting which is called preliminary, and it is to show what they call height, scale, and mass and architectural direction. The second meeting is the preliminary meeting. After you get the approval of the first meeting, you can go to the second meeting, and that's where you are obligated to show further development of the exterior and materials. After you get approved there, you are then required to submit, working drawings. And then you, after you get the working drawings approved, you are obligated to build a mock-up panel. For each of these meetings, it's quite common to get denied for your first meeting. And then you have to revise a design and you have to go through all of these groups again. So it's a very laborious process, but it generally works despite people complaining because it helps to protect Charleston's historic center. Next, please. So for each of these projects, we meet with Historic Charleston Foundation, which is a group that helps to preserve Charleston. They own easements on certain buildings. Next, please. We work with the Preservation Society of Charleston. They are similar to Historic Charleston. Each project has to be reviewed with them. Both of these organizations come to the public BAR meetings and they speak out whether they're in support or not in support of a project. Next, please. We also work with the neighborhood groups. For many of the projects, we work with Josh Martin, who was the assistant to the mayor, and Jacob Lindsay, who was a city planner. They are both have left Charleston now. But they were really helpful in terms of guiding us through the politics. The new city architect is Tori Parrish. She comes from the world of new urbanism. She replaces Dennis Dowd, who was the city architect that we had worked with on most of these projects. Next, please. And then every project needs to be reviewed with the mayor. So when Mayor Riley was mayor, we took him through the various projects. And then now that Mayor Tecklenburg is the new mayor, we work with him on the new projects that we're doing. Next, please. And then ultimately it ends up at the BAR, which is a very formal meeting. It's very regimented in terms of when the architect presents, what they can say, what the community can say, when the BAR responds. I think that DPZ had worked with the city to try to sort of streamline the process, so to speak. Next, please. We also work with local architects. So for many of these projects, we've worked with a prominent local Charleston firm, LS3P. And then we work with Scott Parker, who is a landscape architect. And we work as a design architect. We do schematic design, concept design, schematic design development, and then we're involved with CDs and CA, but with LS3P leading those phases. Next, please. So Courier Square Phase 1 is a mixed-use development. It's 590,000 square feet. It has 220 residential units. It has office and it has retail. Next. It's bounded by Meeting Street and the Greenway, which I'll talk about later, which is an industrial train line that the city is trying to turn into a park system. They call it the Low Line. Next, please. And this was a project, Evening Post Industries is the landowner, and they put out an RFQ with developers and their architect to come up with a financial proposal and a beginning design idea. And this was LS3P, who had worked on the project, teamed up with Greystar and Lincoln Harris, who is an office building developer out of Charlotte. And they had come up with this design. So Scott Parker, who was the owner's rep for Evening Post Industry, the landscape architect, called me and said, we're kind of in a predicament because the newspaper has written about bad development for the last 25 or 30 years. And all of a sudden they are acting as a developer and they want to make sure that they get the best building possible. So Scott asked me if our office would write a pattern book for the firm LS3P to lead them in the direction of doing a good traditional design. I suggested instead that they consider hiring a concept design architect to work with LS3P and help come up with a kind of beginning design idea. They thought it was a good idea, so they interviewed our office and Cooper Robertson and Fairfax Salmons, and we ended up getting the project partly because of our experience, but in the interview I said, the current scheme is not, it's something that we can work with. There's no reason to go back and completely unravel it. It's just going to piss off the developer. They seem to have an attitude that all developers were a problem. And I said, you know, we can work with developers and we'll come on and work with you for 6 weeks to come up with a preliminary idea of the outside of the building. Next, please. It's basically affectionately called a Texas donut. It has 6 stories of elevated parking. It's wrapped on one side with an office building and a residential building on the low line side. Next, please. So we started in a concept phase and we worked on the office and the residential elevations. Next, please. And basically for this project and every project Ramza does, we try to figure out an idea and, you know, why should a building look a certain way? And that was where we started on this project with the office building. Next, please. So we did preliminary elevations, freehand elevations with different ideas of how the office building should look. Next, please. And we looked to precedents, not only in Charleston, the Old Exchange on Meeting Street, but we also looked to London and Regent's Park. And because Meeting Street has some of the best civic and commercial classical buildings, and this site is on the north side, we decided that we would do a classical building here. Next, please. So we do many renderings as part of the design process, not only for the client, but for the BAR. So this is one of the renderings that we did early on. Next. And then the finished building. It's important to note that these types of developers are not, they are good developers, but they are not, say, the top tier types of developers that we work with in New York City. So our challenge to work with them was to show that we could do a better building with them, working with their schedules and their budgets. So this is the office building on Meeting Street. Next, please. It is on the northern part, so it acts as a gateway. It has a pair of towers on either side. It's 4 stories with a penthouse on the 5th floor. We got extra height on the 5th floor and on the 8th floor of this building. And this was before architectural merit even existed at the BAR. Next, please. The materials are a limestone base, stucco facade. There are 16 double-story ionic GFRC columns. The panels and the penthouse are out of FRP. Next, please. And just some of the details associated with it. Next, please. And Greystar ended up making their corporate offices there. So these are some of the shots of the interiors. Next. The building, the residential building, which they ultimately, ironically, named the Guild, next please, is on the other side of the building, hiding the parking, and it's facing a park system, what will soon be a park system called the Low Line. Next, please. And because the Low Line, which was a train line that serviced industrial buildings in this part of Charleston, some of which are still there. On the left is the cigar factory, on the right is the train shed. Many of them are gone. Next, please. We decided that the look of the building should harken back to that industrial past. Next. So these are the computer elevations that we ended up doing. We proposed a clock tower, and behind the clock, next please. This is the rendering. It has wings that bump out from it to get all of the units with windows, and then there are interior garden courtyards located there. Next, please. And then this is the view from above built. We proposed setbacks. We proposed the brick and the architectural character. We also proposed the clock tower. Behind the clock tower is the living room of one of the units. The portion on top of it is just there for decorative reasons. At the end of and I had to sort of twist the developer's arms to do it. And at the end of the project, the developer told me 2 things. He said, you know, my wife hates everything that we do, but she likes this building. And he said, and she loves the clock tower. And I said, Todd, you didn't want to do the clock tower. And he said, well, the apartment rents for $8,000 a month, so we like it now. Next, please. So just a few details. This is all mason laid brick. Next, please. And this is on the bottom right, this is the entry to the parking garage. And on the left, it's just showing the setbacks with the various terraces that the setbacks provide. Next, please. And then Columbus Street retail and what will ultimately be a restaurant, and then the entry into the leasing center. Next, please. And then typical unit on the right-hand side and one of the amenity spaces. Next. Which is up on the upper roof with a pool that looks out over the new bridge and the river. Next, please. So after doing that project, our office got a local reputation as a firm that's easy to work with and that developers like because of the architectural quality of what we were doing. We were able to get them extra floors and extra square footage. So at the end of Courier Square, next please. Evening Post Industries came back to us and said, we would like you to do a study for our other sites. We don't have a developer yet, but we'd like you to beyond height, scale, and mass give us guidelines on what those sites might look like and how they might be developed in the future. So working without a developer, next please. We did an overall master plan, which proposed a new park where the U-Haul site was to be. And we were proposing a hotel or a signature apartment building facing that park. We had proposed a pedestrian walk on Center with the Guild and a new building on King Street. We proposed another site where there might be a large hotel. And then for all of the new buildings facing King Street, because the footprints were so big, we proposed that there would be multiple expressions. And then on the side that faced the residential neighborhood, those lots would have single family house character. Ultimately, the park at the U-Haul site did not work. During the process, Mayor Riley told me, he said, you know, one of the biggest accomplishments of my tenure as mayor was I actually got U-Haul to return my call. So it did not end up being a park, and U-Haul is still currently there. Next, please. This is one of the perspective views that we did of King Street. Everything on the right-hand side is proposed new construction with the taller buildings being lined by lower commercial buildings with retail. Next. And then at the residential side of the neighborhood in St. Philip Street, most of the buildings on the right-hand side are new proposed designs. Again, there's no developer, there were no plans. We just did massing, and then we did architectural renderings that described character. Next, please. So having done the master plan for this site and having had the Guild be such a big hit, you'd think that Evening Post Industries would decide to work with us again on their future phase. They did sort of. They said, we'd like you to compete in a competition for the new buildings. And we, in this competition, we competed again against Fairfax and Salmons and Cooper Carey. So in the foreground, you can see our competition scheme. We proposed a courtyard building, but in this case, we wanted to recess the parking so that it was not a Texas donut. We showed new buildings facing St. Philip Street, the residential neighborhood that would be a lower scale. And then this is part of that development at that point that was to be an office building. You can see the Guild. Next, please. And our big move was, again, to propose a pedestrian park that was on Center with the Guild and a new building that would terminate that access. Next. And on the right, top right, you can see the Guild, which in the site plan is located here. The new pedestrian park would be here. And on the left-hand side was a beginning idea of what the new building might be that would terminate that access. Next. This is an overall street elevation. This project is a single footprint, and that's one of the challenges in Charleston, which is that the new projects and the developers buy large parcels of land, and to do it as a single expression building would just be completely out of scale with Charleston. So on most of these projects, we come up with ways to have multiple expressions, which seems to make sense to us, but it becomes, for some of the architects on the BAR, they think it's sort of facadism, but the community supports it, so we're able to do it. Next, please. And then on the side that faced the residential neighborhood, we proposed new lower scale infill buildings with the taller buildings behind it. The thing to keep in mind is that the height of these buildings has nothing to do with what RAMSA is proposing or what the developers want. It is part of a height district that the city planners and the mayor and the council members, along with DPZ's support, have proposed for this site or this area of Charleston. Next, please. So this is a view of from the pedestrian park facing towards the new building. Next, please. And then this on the left is a close-up of a way to deal with parking where you wouldn't do a Texas donut. You would have the units face out over to a raised courtyard with a view on the right showing a kind of sense of what the architecture character might be. Next, please. So we won the competition. We worked for about 6 weeks with the first developer who was going to do the project. And then they backed out because they got cold feet about working in Charleston. They had already done one building in Charleston and they were concerned about the price. So the project went on hold. Next, please. But it's come back recently when Greystar, who was the developer for Courier Square Phase 1, decided that they would do the project. And so our team is currently working on the concept design. This is the beginning freehand sketch of the buildings facing King Street and some of the townhouses that face one of the alleys. We are likely submitting to the BAR for conceptual design on September 6th. Next, please. As part of the competition, Evening Post Industries was working with a national developer called Liberty Senior Living and interest them in the southern part of the site, which you can see on the bottom left here. Next. So as the first project just north of this went on hold, we started to work on a Liberty Senior Living. They do senior living in Florida, and they did one out outside of Charleston. They are doing this project in Charleston, and where they decide they put their senior living projects, they look at the demographic of people who are in their 40s to 50s in cities where they have high incomes, and they decide, the Liberty decides that's where they're going to build a project. Because typically what happens is when one's parents get older and somebody has a child has a certain type of amount of income, they move their parents to be with them. You know, in addition, Charleston is super walkable. So it's like being an older person in New York City. You don't really need a car. And this project does not have any parking. All the parking for this project is being put elsewhere in the city. Next, please. So since the project terminates Columbus Street, we proposed that there would be a central tower that would terminate the access along with 4-story buildings. And of course, every developer wants an extra floor. So we proposed the upper floor would be in a sloped roof that would be part of the design. There is a motor court, since there is no parking, that there would be drop off at the front of the senior living center. The bottom 3 floors are senior living. The top floors were to be rentals, but the developer discovered that Ramsey co-ops and condos that we do make so much money that they decided that they would do these upper units as to sell. Next, please. After we came up with the design, somebody from Historic Charleston said, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this looks like a building in Charleston that was torn down. It was the orphanage, which we were delighted to hear. We hadn't seen it. And of course, knowing about it, we included it in every presentation after that. Next, please. We did a series of renderings. This is the view down Columbus Street. On the right is the Courier Square Phase 1 tower, with the idea that there would be a building terminating the view down Columbus Street. Next. And then another conceptual view a little bit closer. Next, please. And then a view on King Street, looking from Post and Courier's site on the left-hand side. Next. And then a view north. Each of these renderings are an important tool that we use to convince not only the client, but the community that what we're adding is an asset to Charleston, and we typically pair them with before photos to really emphasize the difference. Next. Swinging around to the residential neighborhood, as part of this project, there's an infill building that we're doing, which is also residential, and you drive through and underneath the building to get into the interior courtyard. Next, please. And then at St. Philip Street in the residential neighborhood, new infill buildings with the taller building peeking out above on the top left. Next, please. And then another view of some of the new infill buildings with the taller building beyond. Next, please. And then a view down Bogart Street and showing the idea that as part of this project, there's going to be a pedestrian alley between the Liberty project and the Courier Square Phase 2 project. Next, please. So we submitted to the BAR about a month ago. We were advised by our developer and our associate architect that the existing building that's right in the middle of the site had zero architectural merit. And so we submitted a demolition approval for that building at the same meeting that we submitted our new building, and all hell broke loose with the preservation groups, and everybody and their brother all of a sudden found historic significance in it. There might be minority-owned businesses in this area. And so the whole project went on hold, and our client and associate architect has been negotiating with the historic groups, and they have just resubmitted the building for demolition, and we have submitted the new project on the same agenda, and we'll see if they agree to demolish it. There was talk about moving it as well. Next, please. So the next project, which is just north of Courier Square, is a mixed-use development with a different developer, Lifestyle Communities. Next, please. And here you can see this is Courier Square 1. This is the project, the Gray Star project, and then that I just discussed. And then this is the site that Lifestyle Communities own, and they are a developer out of Ohio. And their connection to us was Kevin Smith, who is a partner in our office, had been pursuing work with them on in other cities. And that developer ended up buying this parcels of land. And so Kevin Smith and I have been working with them for the last 3 or 4 years, first on parcel 1, and then on the other 3 parcels that you can see here. Next, please. So this is parcel 1. There is a historic train shed building, which we used as a precedent for Courier Square Phase 1. There are historic houses, which are being knitted into the project. There's a historic smokestack, and we had proposed a pedestrian walk where you would walk underneath the building, and then you would connect into the park system that goes north in Charleston and east in Charleston. This has elevated parking that's wrapped on all sides, and it's all residential and restaurants and retail. Next, please. So it truly is a gateway site. You see it from the highway. Here is the site. And then on the top right is the north elevation with the renderings that we did on the bottom right-hand side. You know, one of the challenges for these projects is we want each of them to look different. And so here we decided not to do an industrial look. We're doing more of an Art Deco look along with combinations of other building looks. Next, please. This is another view. On the right-hand side is the view that you'd see once you get off of the exit ramp, which on the left-hand side is what you currently see. That's your first view of Charleston when you drive in from the airport. Next, please. And then along King Street, no, I'm sorry, Meeting Street. There are existing houses which are derelict that are being restored. There is a new building just north of it, and then there are a new lower building behind it. You can see the rendering on the right-hand side. Next, please. And then facing Line Street, one of the things that we and the BAR and the community wanted to do is try to activate Line Street. And so on the right, these are the existing houses with the new buildings to the left. There's a new pedestrian alley with a smokestack. This is the existing train shed building. Next, please. And then on the left bottom is the smokestack, and on the right is what will be a new pedestrian park with buildings that are surrounding it. Next. And then this is under construction now, and these are some of the mock-up panels. We're doing mock-up panels for each of the individual building looks. So this is the materials that were selected and approved by the BAR. Next. And then they came back to us and they asked us next to design their next 3 buildings. Next, Joe. Which are straddling the low-line park system. So there's a smaller building that is just adjacent to Courier Square. There is a site that we affectionately call the Flatiron site. And then to the west of it is another building site. Next, please. They're all apartments. Next, Joe. So when one is driving on the elevated highway, this is parcel 1, which is under construction. This is the Flatiron building, and then this is the building on the west side, and you can see peeking through the buildings is the tower of Courier Square. Next. This is a view looking down Line Street. So this is Courier Square. This is the historic train shed building, and then these are the newer buildings on either side. Again, this is within the height district. That is in the DPZ height district guidelines, although we were able to get extra height from the BAR for some of these buildings because of architectural merit. Next. This is a view looking down Line Street. So on the right is a new building. This is the entry into the pedestrian alley. This is the historic building, and then this is the building on the west side. Next. And then looking north on the low line, on the right is Courier. This is one of the new buildings, and the Flatiron site, the idea was that we would use it to terminate the view, even though the low line continues all the way to the elevated highway. Next. And then another view from the plaza looking down towards the low line and Courier Square. Next, please. And then the historic train shed building, we set the Flatiron building back to propose a plaza and a continuation of the low line next to it. Next, please. So Lifestyle Communities has just come back to us and they want us to go into design development. So we're starting work on those buildings, which would go to the BAR for preliminary review, which is the next review process. The final project I'm showing you is North Market Hotel that I worked with Dan Lobitz, another partner from our office, who has experience in hospitality. Next, please. And this is the last project. This is truly in the historic district. The other projects are on the edge. This is sandwiched on all sides by residential neighborhoods. Next, please. The site is a 2-block parking lot. Market Street, which is the market that everybody goes to, is just south of it. North of it is Ansonboro, and south of it is the French Quarter. Next, please. So here you can see it's a parking lot. And although the parking lot has a road right of way that goes directly through the site, we did not want to have a road bisecting the project. Next, please. So what we proposed is that the city considered giving up the road and turning it into a pedestrian arcade. And as part of it, we would have a pocket park. And so architecturally it made sense, but strategically it was easier for people to give up a road for something that was a pedestrian amenity. It is a hotel, so it has a hotel motor court. It faces the residential neighborhood on one side, and it faces the city market on the other side. Next, please. So again, we did typical views before and after. So you can see on the left-hand or in the lower, these are the views of the building that face the part of the hotel that face the residential neighborhood. So we told the developer, you know, Anson Borough is very powerful within the community. Why don't we make this part of the site have a residential character with a courtyard, which the community ended up loving. Next, please. And then the views facing the market, we said, why don't we do more of a civic kind of great hotel turn of the century look? We proposed doing a porch over the sidewalk, which Jack Robertson had done years ago on his project on Broad Street. And then facing Anson Street, we proposed breaking down the scale with multiple expressions and having the heights of the building be compatible with the heights of the existing buildings on the other side of the street. Next, please. So in conclusion, you know, it's a lot of work for us to do in one place. And at one point, the people from Evening Post Industries said, are you doing too many projects here? And so I mentioned that to Bob Stern, and Bob said, well, John Nash did many projects in London, and it's better for it. The thing is that we don't really have a signature style. So every project that we do has a different sort of look. So it isn't as if it's just a single look kind of firm. But the developers we're working with, these are examples of the projects that Lifestyle Communities has typically done. So, you know, we spend a lot of time with them, helping them see things in a different way. Next, please. And this is what we had proposed. So this is a big leap forward for them. Next, please. And then this is Greystar, who did Courier Phase 1 and the new buildings. This is what they typically do. On the left-hand side is the project that they did in Charleston before they started working with us. Next, please. And this is what we proposed. So beyond adding to Charleston's historic district with buildings that serve as examples of how something can be better, we're also, we think, affecting these developers as they go forward with new projects, even if they're not working with us. So with that said, Leslie, I'll hand it back to you, and we can answer any questions that you or others might have.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, but I'm going to pivot to Nathan, who had his hand raised to ask the first question.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Gary, for showing all that. One of the interesting thing I thought was the fact that your client, who you had just made a bunch of money for, decided to jump in to do another competition to allow you to keep working with them. How was the competition set up? Did they adequately compensate everybody for participating, or, you know, I'm always curious how different people set those up, because I think it's an interesting technique and appropriate in some circumstances, but not in others. Thanks a lot.
It was a paid competition, but I spoke to and it wasn't with Greystar, it was with the landowner, which is Evening Post Industries, and their CFO. And I said, when they asked me, I said, really? I said, Courier Square Phase 1 was such a hit and made money for people and showed that a tall building in Charleston could, have a higher quality. I said, we have to compete. And he said, well, that's just the way it is, And I said, well, we will do it, but it needs to be paid. And we're not going to do it if you're just using our design ideas to lure in a developer. And they said, no, we already have a developer. It's going to happen. You win the competition, I'll go ahead. And lo and behold, we win the competition and we worked with the developer and then they backed out. And then ultimately Greystar came back. So competitions are a little bit, in our attitude, architect abuse.
Thank you. Jeffrey Moen, I'll invite you on if you don't mind to ask your question. I've got some planes flying overhead. Thank you.
Gary, thanks. Wonderful presentation. The work is amazing. And I think a lot of people may not understand how complex these projects are. And I'm wondering, do you work with like associate architects in Charleston to lay out all of the units and work with structural engineers? How does that work typically at Robert A. Stern Architects?
Well, they are super complex, and to whiz through these projects very quickly, it's just, I'm just giving you the veneer of everything. Our office we work with associate architects in some cases, and then we also do full service. So for example, my team for all the projects in Charleston, we did the design and the CDs and the CA. But in Charleston, we're teamed with associate architects, LS3P, and they, depending on each of the projects, they will either lead the layouts of the units, although we, have input on it. Although on Lifestyle Communities, our office led the layouts of the units and coordinated it with the massing. We have a landscape architect, we have structural engineer, we have MEP, we have a civil engineer, we often have a traffic consultant, sometimes we have a PR consultant, we have many attorneys. So these projects, they take hundreds of meetings to finally get to the point of approval. So it is quite complicated.
Yeah. Other question I had, did you receive a lot of sort of criticism from modern architects working in the preservation world of Charleston?
Well, we received two types of criticism. At the first BAR meeting, one of the less friendly BAR members, who is an architect, a modern architect, at the end of my presentation, he said, it looks like a train wreck or a train crash between a brick building and a classical building. And because of how those meetings are organized, I'm standing up there, but I can't respond. And then they open it up to community response, and a gentleman stands up and from the community and says, I can't think of any, he said, I disagree with the comment about the train crash. And he said, I can't think of anything that is more Charleston than a mercantile building meeting a classical building. And I spun my head around and I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I had thought of that. And it ended up being Andrew Gould, who is an architect, talented Charleston architect. So yeah, there is that sort of component. The other component is the height. And, Vitold has written about it in his new book on Charleston, that the height of the new buildings are not compatible with Charleston. But it's part of the height district that's been carefully thought through by the city planners and by DPZ to have higher buildings in a certain location. Because even though people like George Holt and Andrew Gould are doing wonderful infill single family houses, the problem, in my opinion, with Charleston is it never developed an apartment building type. And lots of people want to live in Charleston, but not everybody wants to take care of a historic house. And so in this new height district, Charleston is, and with their developers, are offering a building type which is sort of much needed.
Great, thank you. Nice.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Anthony, and he asks, with all of the groups that are entitled to comment on the design of new projects, how are conflicting recommendations handled? And is there a hierarchy in the group that was listed?
So the only people that vote on whether a project at each of the BAR phases are approvable are the 5 BAR members. Historic Charleston gets up and reads their recommendations. Then the Preservation Society will read their recommendations, but they don't vote. And many times they're conflicting with each other. The city architect, who doesn't vote, he or she gives their recommendations, and then it's thrown back to the BAR for them to decide what to do. Normally what happens is if people are really upset, you get deferred and you have to come back and represent the project with changes. But if you do get approved, the BAR will often say approval with these comments. So they might say, you know, we think you should study this, this, and this. And so, but it, you know, I think that some architects think that it is an onerous process, but, you know, and I don't say this as lip service, is the people that we're working with in Charleston know Charleston better than we do. And they often come up with great ideas and suggestions that if you just listen to people, I mean, good ideas come from everywhere. Many times people have some suggestions that aren't so great, but because everybody has a different opinion, in some cases they cancel each other out if they disagree. So.
Thank you. The next question comes from Matt, and I invite you to come on the screen if you'd like to interact, or I can certainly read the question, whichever you prefer. I think we're a intimate enough group to do that if you like. And if not, I'll read it. Okay. Charleston continues to allow modernist developments within the historic district that are not sensitive to its historic fabric. West Edge, for example. Based on your experience with all of the parties reviewing the projects, how do these offending developments keep being built? What is the vulnerability in the process?
Well, the BAR is made up of architects who are open to the idea of modern buildings happening in Charleston. You know, the majority of what the BAR does is not the new buildings. They review the smaller buildings, the additions, the renovations. You know, they really are on top of that. The problem with new buildings is that the BAR has nothing to do with choosing the architect, you know, whether it's a good traditional architect or a good modern architect. And they really only act as a critic. And so, you know, it's not like they're sitting down and drawing over your design. You know, they'll say, well, what about this or what about that? And the question is how much can you guide a traditional or modern architect by just being a critic? I mean, I think that the best thing to do for a place like Charleston that maybe new urbanist communities have the ability to do is make recommendations of good architects who can contribute to a community without a ton of guidance. And so, you know, the modern architects that they're getting are not, you know, the top-notch modern architects. They're, you know, in many cases, second and third tier. And I don't think that the BAR has the ability to stop a developer within a historic district from doing a modern building. They can help guide them, but they, unless it's really terrible, they can't, and they have done it in the past, they can't stop a project.
Thank you, Gary. Do we have any other questions anyone would like to offer? Either in the chat or live and in person?
I wonder if Marina could, you know, she's on the call. I see she's muted. I'd be curious if she could add to the conversation about the work that DPZ has done in Charleston?
Oh my God, he's putting me in front of fait accompli. Hi, Gary. You know, the Heights work was much less controversial than we anticipated it being. And I think you characterized it actually quite well in terms of how you described it. The developers that we met with were so jaded by the fact that they were put through the ringer in terms of the BAR, that they essentially said to us, you know, if you can give us a more predictable process through the end and help define, in the work that Andres did initially in 2015, help us define a more predictable process and give us some guidelines as to how we're supposed to behave, like where modern buildings are more appropriate, where they're not. And we remember, you know, we gave them this kind of a matrix. Then we don't mind being held to higher standards. And with the Heights, you know, we proposed. I remember that Charleston, the preservationists in Charleston really fought us on this because they were afraid that every developer would avail themselves of this, but very few did, and the BAR actually didn't give it very willingly at all, this additional story for architectural merit. And so they really held the line on what they decided was worthy of architectural merit. And they were able to, if I remember correctly, this was a few years ago now, not only add a story, but also to add an additional story, but take down half the story too. Yeah. Recommend it in case it was contextually more appropriate. So the BAR was given that permission. And, you know, we calibrated. It made so much sense to convert to stories instead of feet. And, you know, we did some pretty good documentation of why that made sense in Charleston and why it made sense to allow certain buildings to go taller. And we correlated it in many cases to the width of some of the streets, especially some of the residential streets. And it went forward. It was quite a smooth process.
Well, we had heard from the people in Charleston good things about working with DPZ and the result of the work effort.
DPZ, do you have a question?
Yeah, some of our better ideas for that in the 2015 plan were actually not implemented. Now, one of the things that was interesting was observing all the various boards in operation. And you actually worked with them a bit. And what we observed was, because the boards were mixed traditional and modernist architects, the traditional buildings got worse as they compromised with the modernists, and the modernist buildings got worse as they compromised with the traditionalists. So they actually became these hybrids that weak in every sense. And one of the things we proposed is that there be specialists in each board, and that a modernist architect could choose a modernist board to elevate their work, and a traditional architect could choose a traditionalist board to help them elevate what they were doing. And that was not taken up. That was entirely considered totally broken. But I think that was a good idea, because there's still architects coming in that are traditional and modern that are not as skillful as you, that actually are asked to compromise. So our idea was to have two kinds of boards. The other thing we found is that the boards were exhausted. You know, so many buildings were coming on, and the meetings were so long that actually there was a chance to have two boards rather than one tired one. And that's what brought up the idea of having a modernist board and a traditional board. The other thing that happened is that the big buildings were being judged by architects who knew nothing about big buildings, only about small houses, and the buildings were being put through the ringer. And so we said there should be a specialist in taller buildings with parking garages in one board, and then a specialist in houses on another. You know, and the architect could actually toggle, the submitting architect could toggle one or the other for expertise. And that also was not taken up. But those are probably the two best ideas. controversial as usual.
No.
I'm sure the school might not approve.
It made them very uncomfortable under us the idea of having a modernist board and a traditional board was just too controversial for them to consider. Because a lot of architects didn't want to classify themselves as one or the other, if you recall.
The modernist architects were also being pulled down, you know, by the traditionalists. It was just complete dribble that was going on. It isn't just the modernists that were made to suffer. I mean, both, everything was extremely mediocre because of that.
Yeah.
Well, the problem with the board is that, you know, if they are willing to approve a traditional building, you know, that is the first hurdle. But they're also expected to review all the details of a traditional building. And if you're a modern architect on the board who's never done a traditional building, you wouldn't know a traditional building even if it fell on your head, you know? And so you end up with, unless you have good architects, say like, you know, Andrew Gould, who knows the traditional details, you end up with architects who can do, you know, if you blur your eyes, the building looks pretty traditional, but it kind of comes down to the details. And if you have a board who doesn't know how to critique, you know, traditional details, then that's
Gary, you're talking about, you're speaking about from your point of view, the traditionalists. The modernists were also being tortured. You know, that's what I saw. I saw both sides actually doing, you know, sometimes quite decent architecture in Charlotte, so being brought down to absolutely mediocre work by traditionalists, actually bringing them down. And I think this is actually a crisis everywhere. If you look at Coral Gables, which everything is mediocre, you know, because of that situation, is everybody's brought down to a kind of mid-level, which is not a traditional nor modern, and the architects are demoralized.
yeah.
Jeff
Gary, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I just had one question for Gary, because I'm curious, since he's been doing so many projects there, have you found that the process has gotten smoother with the BAR?
Yeah, that was my question too. Exactly. It's gotten better since the success of your earlier project.
Yes and no, because I mean, some of the people, half of the people in the BAR are practicing architects. And, you know, you show up for a meeting and they look at you with that look like, oh, you again. And, you know, I mean, that's what has been really good about, you know, I work with Dan Lobitz on one project from our office, and I worked with Kevin Smith on another. And beyond being good architects and designers, you know, it isn't just me showing up every time, you know, and so that has been helpful. I think that I mean, people from Historic Charleston and the Preservation Society, you know, I've gone to dinners with them outside of the BAR. Winslow Hasty asked me to lead a fundraising tour for, you know, their group out to Kiowa, which I did. So you get to know the people that you're working with, and they have a certain amount of trust, you know, that they maybe didn't have the first time that they're working with us. So in some cases, it has been easier. The one thing that is good about the BAR process is that it helps in some ways to keep the developer in check, because, you know, we all know as being architects, when you tell something to a developer and they're paying your bill, they only listen to you, you know, so much. But, you know, I will, as part of the process of working as a developer, even if I know they don't want to do something, I'll say, well, gee, I think that you might want to do a setback here and a setback here, which requires you giving up square footage. And they're like, oh, we've told you we don't want to give up square footage. But by going through that process with the developer, when it gets presented to the BAR and the BAR says to me, how come there's no setbacks? Then I just sort of, you know, look, you know, side eye to my developer. And then it also allows me, when I'm working, you know, after we have to go back and redesign the project, it helps with additional services because I said, you know, I already asked you to consider it and now we have to redesign it. So.
Gary, I'd just like to say that's a great presentation. Thank you. It was excellent work, and you should be very proud of that work. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you. So, and there's a lot of people from our office that have helped. I mean, it's certainly not, beyond Bob Stern and me. It's a whole crew of people that make all of these projects at Ramsey and with the people that we work with on it. So,
Thank you. Many of
Who's
them.
next?
So, Andreas, you had something?
Who's next? Who's the next presenter?
Next up, next month on Live at the Guild, we are going to feature our Guild apprentices. So we will have the Guild Apprentice Hour, which is Thomas Darty and Gian Lloyd. So we're going to bring on the younger professional talent to teach us. So we're excited about that. If we don't have any other questions for Gary, you do have a lot of comments in the chat of gratitude and congratulations on these projects. We're gonna wrap up for this evening and thank you all for being here and supporting the Urban Guild. We really appreciate your time and it's nice to see all of you and stay connected.
great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, everyone.
So.
Let me try this out.